You stand in the grocery aisle for a second longer than usual. Nothing dramatic, just a small pause. You glance at the total on the screen and feel that quiet, familiar tension in your chest. The number isn't shocking. It's just higher. Again. You try to remember what you used to spend here. A year ago. 2 years ago. It feels like you're buying the same things. The same milk. The same bread. The same routine. And yet your paycheck doesn't stretch the way it used to. At first, you tell yourself it's just poor planning. Maybe you've been careless. Maybe you're spending more than you realize. So you tighten up. Fewer takeout meals. Fewer impulse purchases. You double-check subscriptions. You try to be responsible. But even after all that, something still feels off. Your income hasn't gone down. In fact, maybe it even went up. A small raise. A new opportunity. On paper, you're earning more than you were before. And yet the sense of progress feels strangely absent. It's like walking forward on a moving sidewalk that's slowly going the opposite direction. This experience is subtle. There's no headline announcing it in your daily life, no clear moment where someone tells you that you've taken a step backward. It just shows up quietly. In your rent renewal notice, in your insurance premium, in the cost of replacing something that used to be affordable without a second thought. Over time, this quiet pressure begins to shape your decisions. You hesitate a little more. You postpone certain plans. You tell yourself you'll feel comfortable once you hit a certain number in your bank account. But that number seems to drift further away, almost as if it's adjusting itself faster than you can reach it. It's easy to internalize this, to assume the discomfort means you're falling behind, that you should be working harder, saving more, optimizing better. But what if the issue isn't only about effort? What if there's something built into the system itself that slowly reduces the power of every dollar you earn, without asking for your permission and without making much noise? There's a kind of tax that doesn't show up on your pay stub. It isn't deducted in a single visible line, and yet you pay it every year. Most people feel it long before they fully understand it. And once you begin to see it clearly, the conversation about income, saving, and stability starts to look very different. So before we talk about solutions or strategies, it's worth slowing down and understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface. Most people think about inflation as a headline number. 3%, 5%, maybe higher. It sounds abstract, distant, like something economists debate on television. But inflation isn't really a number. It's more like a slow leak. Imagine carrying a bucket of water home every 2 weeks. Your paycheck. You work for it. You carry it carefully. You don't spill much, but there's a tiny crack at the bottom of the bucket. Not big enough to notice at first. Just enough that by the time you arrive, there's a little less water than you expected. So you decide to walk faster. Work longer. Earn a slightly bigger bucket. But the crack is still there. Over time, the leak compounds. Not in dramatic drops, but in quiet reductions. And because it happens gradually, your brain adapts to it. Psychologically, we're wired to notice sudden loss. A pay cut would alarm you immediately. A missed paycheck would demand action. But a steady erosion? That feels normal, almost invisible. This is part of why the inflation tax is so effective. It doesn't feel like a tax. No one sends you a bill labeled purchasing power adjustment. Instead, the price of groceries inches up. The cost of housing resets. Services quietly reprice themselves. And because the changes are spread across everything, there's no single villain to point to. It's more like gravity. You don't wake up angry at gravity. You just accept that it exists. But if gravity slowly increased each year while your strength stayed the same, eventually lifting the same weight would feel heavier. Not because you got weaker, but because the force against you grew. That's what's happening with your paycheck. When your salary increases by 3%, but your cost of living rises by 4%, you technically moved forward, but in real terms, you stepped back. The difference is small enough to ignore in 1 year, large enough to matter over a decade. And here's where it becomes psychologically confusing. We tend to think in nominal terms. The number on the paycheck, the size of the raise, the dollar amount in the savings account. Bigger numbers feel like progress. But what actually determines your financial reality isn't the size of the number. It's what the number can do. Purchasing power is quieter than income. It doesn't show up in celebration, emails from HR. It doesn't come with a sense of accomplishment. It simply determines how far your effort travels in the real world. And when that distance shrinks, even slightly, the emotional effect is subtle but persistent. You start to feel like you're running on a treadmill set just a little too fast. Not enough to throw you off, just enough to keep you from ever feeling fully stable. This reframing changes something important. The frustration many people feel isn't necessarily about lifestyle, inflation, or poor discipline. It may be about the silent gap between earning more money and actually advancing. And once you begin to see inflation not as an event, but as a constant background force, it becomes harder to ignore how much of your financial life is shaped by it. I remember a year when I received a raise that I had quietly been hoping for. It wasn't huge, but it felt meaningful, a recognition of effort, a sign that I was moving forward. I did the math in my head and imagined how much easier things would feel. A little more margin, a little more breathing room. For the first few months, nothing seemed different. I kept the same habits. I didn't upgrade my lifestyle. I told myself I was being disciplined, responsible. And yet, by the end of that year, I found myself staring at my bank balance with the same familiar question. Why does this still feel tight? There wasn't a single purchase I could blame. No dramatic mistake, no reckless spending. If anything, I was more careful than before. But small increases had quietly rearranged the landscape around me. Rent adjusted upward. Utilities crept higher. Insurance renewed at a new rate. Even routine expenses felt slightly heavier. Individually, each change was manageable. Together, they absorbed the raise almost completely. What unsettled me wasn't the math. It was the realization. I had associated earning more with progressing. I assumed that if my income increased, my sense of stability would increase with it. But stability didn't automatically follow. It stayed just out of reach, as if it had moved the goalpost without telling me. That was the moment something shifted internally. I stopped asking, "Why am I not saving enough?" and started asking, "What is happening to the value of what I earn?" It wasn't a dramatic awakening, just a quiet recognition that the game board itself was changing, that my effort was constant, but the purchasing power attached to that effort was not. There's a subtle emotional toll in that realization. You begin to question your progress. You wonder if you're mismanaging something. You compare yourself to where you thought you would be by now. And because the changes are gradual, it's easy to turn the frustration inward. But when I looked closely, the pattern was clear. The raise hadn't failed me. My discipline hadn't failed me. The environment had shifted in ways that weren't immediately visible. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The feeling of standing still wasn't just about effort. It was about erosion. Quiet, consistent, almost polite. That awareness didn't solve anything overnight. But it did change how I interpreted the discomfort. It gave context to a tension I had been carrying without fully understanding. Once you recognize that inflation is always present, something subtle begins to change. You stop measuring progress purely by the size of your paycheck. You start paying attention to what that paycheck can actually sustain over time. The focus shifts from income alone to durability. I began to see that working harder wasn't a complete defense. Earning more helped, of course, but if the underlying force kept eroding purchasing power, then effort by itself would always feel slightly behind. What helped wasn't urgency. It was clarity. Clarity about the difference between storing money and positioning it, between keeping cash still and allowing it to participate in growth. Inflation quietly rewards movement and penalizes stagnation. Not emotionally, just mathematically. This realization changed the way I viewed stability. I used to think stability meant minimizing fluctuation, keeping everything steady, predictable, safe from visible loss. But in an environment where the value of money is constantly shifting, absolute stillness isn't neutral. It slowly tilts backward. Real stability began to look different. It looked less like protection from change and more like resilience within change. It meant accepting that some short-term movement isn't chaos. It's adaptation. It's alignment with the fact that the world around your money is moving whether you want it to or not. There's a quiet independence that comes from understanding this. When you realize that inflation is not a temporary phase but a structural feature, you stop waiting for things to go back to normal. You stop assuming that next year will simply feel easier on its own. Instead, your thinking becomes longer, more measured. You begin to evaluate decisions not just by how safe they feel today, but by how they behave over years. You notice the difference between assets that drift with inflation and assets that have the potential to outpace it. Not perfectly, not every year, but consistently over time. This isn't about chasing returns or reacting to headlines. It's about refusing to let erosion define your trajectory. The shift is internal before it's external. You start seeing your money less as something to defend from the world, and more as something that needs to engage with it. Carefully, thoughtfully, but actively. And that small mental adjustment can create a very different sense of control. And maybe that's the deeper shift. The frustration so many people carry isn't a personal failure. It isn't a lack of discipline or ambition. Often it's the quiet confusion of sensing that something is off without having language for it. When your paycheck feels smaller each year, even as the number grows, it can slowly chip away at your confidence. You begin to question your progress. You wonder if you're falling behind some invisible standard. But once you understand the hidden inflation tax, the feeling starts to make sense. You see that the tension wasn't imaginary. The pressure wasn't exaggerated. It was structural, subtle, steady, built into the background of the system you operate in every day. And that awareness does something important. It separates your identity from the environment. You are not irresponsible because groceries cost more. You are not incompetent because housing resets higher. You are not behind simply because the purchasing power of a dollar quietly declines over time. The landscape has been shifting beneath your feet. Seeing that clearly doesn't eliminate inflation. It doesn't freeze prices or magically expand your paycheck. But it restores perspective, and perspective restores calm. Instead of reacting with self-blame, you begin to respond with understanding. Instead of chasing bigger numbers alone, you start thinking in terms of real value, in durability, in positioning yourself in a way that acknowledges reality rather than denying it. There's something grounding about that. The world will continue to change. Prices will continue to adjust. Currencies will continue to move. But your awareness of those forces gives you a steadier footing. And maybe that's the quiet advantage, not panic, not urgency, just clarity. Because once you understand why your paycheck feels smaller each year, you stop interpreting that feeling as weakness. You begin to see it as information. And information, when understood calmly, has a way of turning uncertainty into something you can stand on.